Once again, on behalf of the National Park Service, let me welcome you to Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Ranger Karlton Smith, and I'm presenting what was supposed to be the last midwinter talk for the year. But two of the talks that were canceled because of the snow have been rescheduled. Okay? Saturday, March 14th, will be Buster Keaton and the General. And there'll be an introduction and commentary by Evangeline Rubikova. And on Sunday, March 22nd, Injustice Must Cease Before Peace Can Prevail. Frederick Douglass, The Post-Civil War Years. And that's going to be presented by Mark Malloy from the Frederick Douglass House National Historic Site. So he's one of our guest rangers we're bringing in for the talks. So those two talks have been rescheduled. So mark them on your calendar and pick them up if you can. Everybody ready for warm weather?
Yes.
Yeah. I think somebody said Wednesday is supposed to be about 61. So I think everybody's ready. But the talk today is going to be on Admiral Farragut, the closing scenes of the Civil War. Farragut, the end of the war, and just a little bit beyond. In January of 1863, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles wrote in his diary, Farragut has prompt, energetic qualities, but no fondness for written details, does but one thing at a time, but does that strong and well, is better fitted to lead an expedition through danger and difficulty than to command an extensive blockade, is a good officer in a great emergency, would more willingly take great risk in order to obtain great results than any officer in high position in either naval or military service. And unlike most of them, prefers that others should tell the story of his well-doing than relate it himself. By September of '63, at the meeting with Admiral Farragut, who was home on leave for a little bit, Welles wrote in his diary, the more I see and know of Farragut, the better I like him. He has the qualities I supposed when he was selected. The ardor and sincerity which struck me during the Mexican War when he wished to take Veracruz with the unassuming gentleness of a true hero. By August of 1864, Farragut has been responsible for taking New Orleans, the largest city in the South, taking his fleet up to Vicksburg in an unsuccessful attempt to take that city. He's going to run his ships past Port Hudson in March of 1863 in support of the Vicksburg operations. And on August 5th of 1864, Farragut will run his ships into Mobile Bay, closing off the city of Mobile to Confederate blockade runners. Fort Morgan, which guards the entrance to Mobile Bay, was surrendered on August 22nd of 1864. But the city of Mobile itself is still holding out at this point. And by August 27th, Farragut is writing to the Navy Department about the operations around Mobile. And he also said, I fear, however, my health is giving way. I have now been down in this Gulf and the Caribbean Sea nearly 5 years out of 6, with the exception of the short time at home last fall, and the last 6 months have been a severe drag upon me, and I want rest, if it is to be had. With the fall of Mobile Bay, the last remaining port open to Confederate blockade runners is Wilmington, North Carolina, guarded at the mouth of the Cape Fear River by Fort Fisher. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Gustavus Fox, wants Farragut to replace Acting Rear Admiral Samuel P. Lee as commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. Welles himself felt that Admiral Lee is true and loyal, careful and circumspect almost to a fault. But while vigilant, he had not dash and impetuous daring. But Welles wasn't sure about transferring Farragut to that position. He said to withdraw Farragut from Mobile suddenly would give cause for censure. The country is expecting the capture of Mobile. If Farragut is recalled, the failure or omission to take the city will be imputed to the Navy Department. Besides, to withdraw Farragut and place him in the North Atlantic Squadron would be to advertise our object and cause the rovers to prepare for the work. In other words, if you take Farragut out of the West Gulf Blockading Squadron, suddenly put him in charge of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, there's only one reason to do that. He's going to be the man to attack and take Fort Fisher. And the minute the Confederates find out about that, they're going to prepare their defenses. So we don't want to advertise what we want to do. On July 6, 1864, the Navy Department received the official word that on June 19th, the USS Kearsarge had attacked and sank the Confederate raider CSS Alabama. And Welles was excited about this. He said, violent attacks were made upon the department and myself for the reason that our naval vessels are not efficient, had no speed, but in the account of this battle, the Kearsarge is said to have had greater steaming power than the Alabama, and to have controlled the movements. Our large smoothbore guns, the Dahlgrens, have been ridiculed and denounced by the enemies of the department. But the swift destruction of the Alabama is now imputed to the great guns which tore to pieces. And a letter from Admiral Farragut talking about the need or the qualities for captains of ironclads. Farragut also told the secretary his views about all these new guns and equipment coming online. And he wrote, in conclusion on this point, permit me to say that I think the world is sadly mistaken when it supposes that battles are won by this or that kind of gun or vessel. In my humble opinion, the Kearsarge would have captured or sunk the Alabama as often as they might have met under the same organization and officers. The best gun and the best vessel should certainly be chosen, but the victory 3 times out of 4 depends upon those who fight them. I do not believe that the result would have been different if the Kearsarge had nothing but a battery of 8-inch guns and a 100-pounder chase rifle. What signifies the size and caliber of the gun if you do not hit your adversary? In other words, it is important to have the best ships and the best guns, but you can have the biggest gun in the world. If you can't hit anything with it, what good is it? And that's the point Farragut's getting across. Yes, let's have the big guns, but let's make sure our sailors are trained on how to use them. That's the important part. Welles is going to write the Admiral on November 9th. It is the wish of the department that you should feel at liberty to turn over command of the West Gulf Squadron to the next officer in rank to yourself at any time you may see fit. So Farragut is now authorized to come home for a visit and to rest. Farragut replied on November 22nd that he would turn over command to Commodore James S. Palmer on or about December 1st. He also added, although my health is once more good, I feel that the respite from the duties of a squadron will be a great service to me and enable me to commence any new work with more energy. Farragut's flagship, which had served as his flagship from New Orleans through all the operations in the Gulf, the USS Hartford, will leave Mobile Bay on November 28th. They make a stopover at Pensacola and then leave there on November 30th. The Hartford arrives off the Battery in New York City on December 12, 1864. The word has already gotten out that Admiral Farragut is in a sense coming home. And there's a crowd on the Battery waiting for the Hartford to dock. And there were people who couldn't wait for that. There were actually private boats going out to the Hartford to try to catch a glimpse of the Admiral, even before he got to New York City. From there, he's going to be taken to the Custom House, where a crowd was waiting for him that was wild with enthusiasm. They'd only greeted Farragut, but they invited him to become a member, a citizen of New York City, and to live in New York City among them. In Farragut's remarks, he stated, "I have been devoted to the service of my country since I was 8 years of age. My father devoted to it before me. I have not specially deserved these demonstrations of your regard. I owe everything perhaps to chance and to the praiseworthy exertions of my brother officers serving with me. That I have been very fortunate is most true, and I am thankful, deeply thankful for it, for my country's sake." On December 20th, the USS Hartford is turned over to Rear Admiral Hiram Paulding at the New York Navy Yard, and Farragut's flag will be hauled down for the last time on the Hartford. But the next day, December 21st, Farragut gets some great news. He's now been promoted from Rear Admiral to Vice Admiral, the first Vice Admiral in the Navy. So he now outranks everybody in the service. On December 31st, he's invited back to the Custom House. And a committee there, representing the merchants of New York City, wanted to recognize Farragut's service to the country. And in the memorial they presented him, it states, "The citizens of New York can offer no tribute equal to your claims on their gratitude and affection. Their earnest desire is to receive you as one of their number, and to be permitted as fellow citizens to share in the renown you will bring to the metropolitan city. This desire is felt in common by the whole community, and in the hope that it may not be inconsistent with your own views, the grateful duty has been confided to us of placing in your hands the accompanying testimonial," at which point Farragut is handed an envelope containing just over $50,000 in U.S. government bonds. Now, at the time, this was not considered illegal, immoral, or anything else. This was simply their expression of thanks to Farragut for what he had done. Of course, they're probably also hoping he'll take some of that money and buy a house in New York City. So if there's a bribe implied, that's it. But I can't imagine General Schwarzkopf coming back from the first Gulf War and somebody giving him an envelope filled with $100,000 or something like that. That'd be all over the press at this point. As far as Farragut, the citizens of New York wanting Farragut to live among them, just think back to the 1950s when word got out that General Eisenhower purchased a farm in Gettysburg. Imagine the people of Gettysburg thinking General Eisenhower now is going to be our neighbor. And the same reaction was probably among the people of New York if Farragut decides to live among them. But Farragut and his wife were retired to their home on Hastings-on-Hudson, just north of New York City. They had moved here from Portsmouth in 1860. When Virginia seceded from the Union, Farragut didn't hesitate. He basically told his wife, "I'm leaving, and you can either stay here with your family or go with me." And she went with him, no hesitation. And so they ended up at Hastings-on-Hudson, as I said, just north of New York City. But they're not there very long, because they arrived in Washington, D.C. 4 days later with Captain Dryden, who had been the captain of the Hartford and Farragut's fleet captain at Mobile Bay. And Secretary Welles wrote in his diary on January 14th, "Admiral Farragut came a week since and called on me. After half an hour or more of conversation on affairs connected with his command, the capture of Mobile and matters generally, I went with him to the President. In the evening, he with Mrs. F. and Captain Dryden spent the evening with us." But in the latter part of January, Commodore James K. Mitchell, who had commanded Confederate naval forces at the Battle of New Orleans, and who was married to Eliza Loyal, Mrs. Farragut's first cousin, is now commanding Confederate naval ships on the James River. And he has a squadron of about 11 ships. As his intention moved down the river and tried to attack General Grant's supply base at City Point. The backbone of the fleet of his squadron are 3 ironclads, the CSS Richmond, Virginia II, and the Fredericksburg. The only Union ironclad on the river at this point is a double-turreted USS Onondaga. Most other ships are down off the coast of North Carolina in the Fort Fisher expedition. They haven't come back yet. And the Onondaga and Union gunboats withdraw on the advance of Mitchell's squadron. But Mitchell attempts to break through the obstructions at Trent's Reach on the night of January 23rd and 24th. 2 of his ironclads, the Virginia and the Richmond, are going to run aground. The Onondaga comes back and now fires on those 2 grounded ironclads, and Mitchell is stopped in his advance. But on the night of January 24th, Will said, "The President sent for me this evening, found Stanton, Secretary of War Stanton, with him, having a dispatch from General Grant desiring him to request me to remove Commander William Parker, the senior officer on the Upper James. After some conversation, informing them that we had 2 gunboats above and that the Atlanta and Ironsides had been ordered thither, I mentioned that Farragut was here, and the President sent for him. On hearing how matters stood, he had once volunteered to visit the force." So Farragut's now going to leave D.C. to head down towards City Point and check things out. Before Farragut even gets there, Commodore William Radford has arrived to replace Parker in command. Farragut finds the situation is under control and heads back to Washington, D.C. During the next month or so, the Farraguts enjoy a round of dinner parties, including at least one at the White House. Farragut is present at President Lincoln's second inauguration on March 4th of 1865, and he attends the White House reception at that night. The Admiral and Mrs. Farragut will pay a visit to Norfolk, Virginia, in late March of 1865. At noon on April 3rd of 1865, Brigadier General George H. Gordon is going to write that he had received word of the fall of Richmond. He said, "In a moment I was with Admiral Farragut. He could hardly contain himself at the news. In his hand he held a copy of my dispatch. Could this news be true?" The Admiral doubted, but his wife did not. She was jubilant. She had never a misgiving. So the 2 men now say, "Hey, let's go to Richmond." So they take a boat up to City Point, up the James River to Aiken's Landing, and they have to stop there. Then they have to get on horseback for the rest of the trip. And General Gordon did say it was quite a sight to see the Admiral trying to mount a horse. First of all, he's not very big. He's only about 5 feet 5, about 5'5". That's it. And he's a Navy guy. And Navy guys are not used to riding horses. So first of all, they had to get the Admiral on the horse. And then they would proceed to Richmond. But they arrived in Richmond on the morning of April 4th. They're going ahead for the old Confederate White House, which is being used by General Godfrey Wetzel as his headquarters. And General Gordon said, "At the White House, here we found General Wetzel. The rebel president's wines had been preserved, and in his parlor we drank to the health of the fugitive ruler of the Confederacy." But now it comes time for the Admiral and the General to head back downriver. And Farragut makes the suggestion they do that on a boat, rather than on the horses this time. The only boat they can find in Richmond is the Confederate flag of truce boat, with the Confederate flag still on it. Farragut would take command of that boat, and they head downriver. Coming up the river, they meet another boat. And on that boat, General Godfrey said, or General Gordon said, among them I recognized Admiral Porter and Abraham Lincoln. Porter's expression was one of blank amazement. The presence was sad, but dissatisfied. Probably the last person Porter expected to see coming down river was Admiral Farragut. I doubt Farragut made any crude comments or anything, but he had to be thinking, David, I beat you again, up to Richmond. There is a report that the president yelled over to Farragut, who had been to Libby Prison, how the president found Libby Prison. And Farragut yelled back he found it full of rebel prisoners this time, not Union prisoners. They're going to arrive back in Norfolk by daylight of April 5th. The Farraguts then would try to visit Portsmouth, their old hometown. Both of Farragut's wives came from Portsmouth. Mrs. Farragut's family is from Portsmouth. The admiral made it his home port whenever he wasn't out sailing. But most of the people they knew in Portsmouth wanted nothing to do now with Admiral Farragut. Most of them kind of said to his face, we have nothing to say to you after all this time. And Farragut told his wife, that's the last time we're going to come to Portsmouth. And it was. They never went to Portsmouth again. Farragut, though, will return to Washington on the news of President Lincoln's assassination. Then they retired to Hastings-on-Hudson for a much-needed rest for the admiral. But on July 6th of 1865, the admiral would attend a peace jubilee at Faneuil Hall in Boston. Not only features Admiral Farragut, but also General Robert Anderson. Neither the admiral or the general are going to give a speech, but the crowd was invited to come up on the platform and shake their hands. And reportedly something close to 2,500 people came up to shake their hands. Later that night at the Union Club in Boston, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the poet and writer, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. is the Supreme Court Justice. So this is the father. And among other things, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. had written a poem about old Ironsides that saved the U.S.'s Constitution. The speech to the admiral, or the poem he wrote, was a toast to the vice admiral. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can look it up if you want to. But just to give you a flavor of what he said, scarce one tall frigate walks the sea, or skirts the safer shores. Of all the board of victory, our stout old Commodores, Hall, Bainbridge, Porter, where are they? The answering billows rose still bright in memory's sunset ray. God rest each gallant soul. A brighter name must dim their light with more than noontide ray. The Viking of the river fight, the conqueror of the bay. Presumably with some of the money the merchants of New York had given him, Farragut would purchase a house at 113th 36th Street in New York City. On July 25th, 1866, Farragut was promoted to the rank of full admiral. Again, the first full admiral in American history. So Farragut again outranks everybody in the Navy. Farragut, though, is a fairly conservative individual, and he's going to basically support President Andrew Johnson's call for Reconstruction in the South as opposed to the radical Republicans. At this time, Lieutenant Commander George Dewey, who as a young lieutenant had served on the USS Mississippi at New Orleans, met Farragut again. And he said he seemed as lively as in the days on the Mississippi, and we thought he would live to hale old age to enjoy the honors he had so deservedly won. But Farragut can also be kind of an unassuming guy. Here you see Farragut on the deck of the Hartford next to Captain Dryden. So you kind of see he is kind of a short guy here. And Dryden said that Admiral Farragut is the last man in a crowd that would be selected as the bravest officer and the best sailor in our fleet. He is rather stout, quiet, and unobtrusive in his manners, with a voice soft and pleasant. His face indicating mildness and humanity, and on a smile of good nature and contentment continually plays. But a few moments of conversation convinces one that he has talent and intelligence, is well read in all that pertains to his profession, as well as in general literature. The flash of his eyes shows that he knows how to command, and that his skill and success are well earned. In June of 1867, Farragut is appointed to command the European squadron. He'll raise his flag on the USS Franklin, under the command of Captain Alexander M. Pennock, who was married to Margaret Loyal, another first cousin of Mrs. Farragut, and it also makes him the brother-in-law of former Confederate commander James K. Mitchell. So even in this small Farragut family circle, the Civil War is going to tear this family apart. One of the things I found out as a footnote is Alexander Pennock himself is from Portsmouth, Virginia. And at one point in the 1860 census, he is living in the Loyal household along with John K. Mitchell. So these connections are pretty tight sometimes. And Farragut's only instruction from Secretary Welles in taking over command of the squadron is to not glide too often to the masthead. A reference to Farragut at Mobile Bay, where he climbed the mast to get above the smoke of the battle. And for the first time on June 17, 1867, the Admiral's four-star flag was raised on a U.S. warship. Farragut is not unknown in Europe. Everybody's heard of Admiral Farragut and his exploits. He's considered the first sailor of the age. So anybody who's anybody in Europe wants to meet him. Among other things, Farragut will dine with Emperor Napoleon III in Paris. He'll meet Grand Duke Konstantine in Russia. He'll dine with King Christian IX of Denmark. And of course, when he gets to England, he'll have tea with Queen Victoria. On the trip of the European squadron, besides the countries along the Atlantic coast, he also goes into the Mediterranean. He'll stop at, and you have to forgive my pronouncement of this, Ciudadella, Minorca, which was the birthplace of Farragut's father. And they will give him a party when he gets there. He also goes to the other end of the Mediterranean to visit the fabled city of Constantinople. And on the way back, he'll stop at the port of Trieste. The Franklin returns to the United States on November 10th of 1868, just after the presidential election that year. And it was reported that Farragut had been out of range of the shafts of political malice, out of range of the mud which party hacks have been flinging against so many distinguished officers. He can congratulate the successful candidate without having his courtesy misinterpreted or made the signal for calumny. He has been, as it were, up in the shrouds above the smoke of the political conflict. So Farragut hasn't had a say in this political contest. Nobody's been going after him trying to get his opinion who should be the next president, anything like that. So he's been above this whole thing. He will attend President Grant's first inauguration on March 4th of 1869. And Grant immediately makes his appointments for his cabinet. He's going to appoint Alfred E. Bory, Secretary of the Navy. Now, Bory knows almost absolutely nothing about the Navy. This is a guy who probably doesn't even know port from starboard, anything like that. So to make up for that, Bory will issue a directive almost immediately that all correspondence directed to the Navy Department will be sent through Vice Admiral David Dixon Porter. So in a sense, it's Vice Admiral Porter who's running the Navy Department and not the Secretary of the Navy. And former Secretary of the Navy Welles knew what impact this was going to have on Farragut. He said, Farragut feels acutely the slight that is shown him, and the orders and movements which were calculated to, and I'm constrained to believe were intended to annoy him. Now keep in mind, Farragut's a full admiral, and here's a vice admiral basically giving him orders. And it didn't stop there. Commodore James Alden, the head of navigation, the head of the Bureau of Navigation, changed Farragut's flag to alternate stripes of red and white. And he changed the uniform. He was going to change the whole uniform. Farragut refused to accept either one of those changes. He continued to wear the old uniform he had and to fly the 4-star Admiral flag. He was offered the appointment of Port Admiral of New York, and he turned it down. Probably because he thought that was, it didn't match what he had done. Being commander of the European squadron is one thing. Being Port Admiral of New York was something else. So Farragut refused all 3 of those orders in a sense. And this situation doesn't last very long. After about 3 months, George Robeson is announced as the new Secretary of the Navy. Now, he doesn't know anything more about the Navy than Bory did. But he does do one thing, and that is he's going to ease Porter out of his position. So now all orders would go through the Secretary of the Navy like they're supposed to. In the summer of 1869, Farragut and his wife would take a trip to California to see the Mare Island Navy shipyard. Farragut had established a shipyard back in the 1850s, and he wanted to see how things were going. And again, the people of Vallejo, right next to the yard, are going to celebrate the Admiral's arrival and welcome him back to their city. In October, when he's returning home and passing through Chicago, Admiral Farragut would suffer a serious heart attack. General Sheridan, who was there at the time, wrote to General Sherman, who's now the commanding general of the Army. Admiral Farragut is here and unwell. He is an old man, and the doctor thinks, without desiring to create any alarm, that it would be well to send his son, who is at Fort Preble, Portland, Maine, here without delay. That's not going to happen. Farragut does recover from this heart attack, returns home, but then has a series of heart attacks over the winter. In January of 1870, Farragut would take charge of the naval ceremony receiving the remains of philanthropist George Peabody, who had died in London on November 4th, 1869. The remains were being brought home from England on board the HMS Monarch. This would be Farragut's last official duty for the Navy. Then Lieutenant Commander Winfield Scott Shealy, who had served with Farragut at Port Hudson on the Mississippi, saw Farragut at this time. And Shealy said, remember the conversation this way. Shealy said, Admiral, I am glad to see you looking so well after the alarming reports of your illness. Farragut responded, do you think so? I am very far from being a well man. I recollect you then said I belonged to that class of men who would preserve their vigor and vitality into a ripe old age, and that when the break comes would go in a year. It looks to me now that this may be so, but I shall never forget how I was impressed by what you said. At this point, Farragut rarely leaves his home in New York except to attend services at the Church of the Incarnation at Madison Avenue and 35th Street, not too far from his home. His physicians would now advise Admiral Farragut to pay a visit to Commodore Pennock, who's now the Commandant of the Portsmouth Navy Yard in New Hampshire. This is in the summer of 1870. On June 26, Farragut wrote to Admiral Porter, "My physicians are decidedly of the opinion that a change of air would be highly beneficial to me, and I do not doubt that this little trip by sea will also be of service." On July 4th of 1870, the Navy Department placed the USS Teleposta at Admiral Farragut's disposal. And he's going to board the ship in full uniform, making the statement, "It would be well if I died now in harness." Lieutenant Commander George Dewey also sees Admiral Farragut at this time. And Dewey now reports it was a shock to see how pale and thin he had become. Yet, ill as he was, he retained his old-time cheerful manner, which endeared him to his subordinates. It's been said that at Portsmouth, Admiral Farragut boarded the USS Dale, an old sailing sloop. I found out the USS Dale was not in Portsmouth at this time, but the USS Marion, a Dale-class sloop, was. And I think that's what some of the confusion gets. So it's Farragut's walking the deck of the Marion, which is in basically in mothballs at this point. He has a caretaker on board. And as Farragut is leaving the ship, he turns to the caretaker and says, "This is the last time I shall ever tread the deck of a man of war." On August 15th, a communique was sent out by the Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary of the Navy has the painful duty of announcing to the Navy and the country the death of the highest officer in the service, David Glasgow Farragut, Admiral of the Navy of the United States, died at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at Meridian, the 14th instant, in the 70th year of his age. The life of this officer has been spent in the service of his country. The record of his deeds is written on the noblest pages of our history, as death will be mourned by the whole people who loved while they honored him. Farragut's funeral occurred on August 17th, 1870, at St. John's Church in Portsmouth. The burial was in a temporary vault while they decided where the admiral would find rest. There was some talk he might be taken to Annapolis to the Naval Academy. Mrs. Farragut decides to accept the invitation of the city of New York for the admiral to be buried there. Among those attending the funeral on August 17th was former Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Fox, and Major General Nathaniel Banks. No representative from the current Grant administration was in attendance, and President Grant heard about that. You can believe it. The USS Guerriere is assigned to take the admiral's remains to New York. She's going to run aground, and the remains have to be transferred to the USS Brooklyn, sometimes referred to as Farragut's unfortunate ship. At the Battle of Mobile Bay, the Brooklyn was the lead ship, with the Hartford right behind it. When Captain James Alden of the Brooklyn saw the USS Tecumseh go down, hit a mine, and go down less than 2 minutes, he stopped his ship, backing everybody else up under the guns of Fort Morgan. That's when Farragut would take the lead with the famous quote, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," leaving the Brooklyn behind. Farragut's funeral will be held in New York City on September 30th. One historian has commented this is an example of how the weather is no respecter of rank. And on September 30th was one long continuous downpour of cold rain. But among the mourners now will be President Grant and members of his cabinet, trying to make up for not having been at Portsmouth. Farragut was laid to rest in Brooklawn Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. Former Union General James Grant Wilson stated, "I believe the admiral was more beloved than any other commander of the late war, either of the Army or Navy." Mrs. Virginia Loyal Farragut who passed away in 1884. They had one son, Loyal Farragut. His wife died in 1896. Loyal himself died in 1916. Loyal was the only child of the admiral, and he had no issue. So there are no descendants of Admiral Farragut. There might be some great-great nieces and nephews through other members of his family, but no direct descendants of the admiral. But the admiral has not been forgotten. Anybody who's ever gone to Washington, D.C. can visit Farragut Circle in Washington itself. This was dedicated on April 25th of 1881. 1 month later, in May of 1881, the city of New York would dedicate a monument to Farragut in Madison Square Park, done by Augustus St. Gardens. So people are not sparing any, they're not being cheap in these monuments to Farragut. And in 1920, the Navy Academy Chapel will add the Farragut Memorial Window. In 1880, Loyal Farragut wrote about his father. When actually engaged in battle, he always seemed to enjoy the conflict, and yet there was a gentle and sentimental side to his nature. I have heard him remark with sadness, war is a terrible business. It is demoralizing and brings out the worst characteristics of men. But we must go to war, or more terrible things may follow. In a letter to Loyal Farragut written in February of 1900, now Admiral of the Navy, George Dewey, is going to state his feelings for the admiral. George Dewey, as I said, had served with Farragut on the Mississippi as young lieutenant. Because of his victory at Manila Bay in 1898, Congress created the special rank of Admiral of the Navy for George Dewey. And he's the only naval officer to hold that rank. But Dewey also wrote, in all my operations in the Philippines, the example of the great admiral, your father, was constantly before me. I often said to myself in quiet and great emergencies, what would Farragut have done under like emergencies? And when I entered Manila Bay, immediately on arriving off the coast, I felt sure I was doing exactly as he would have done. In 1904, Rear Admiral William Scott Seeley would state the wide difference that was apparent between the sprightly, kind, mild, and pleasing gentleman, even when under a heavy load of responsibility, and his lion-like character and presence when battle was going on was the contrast between sunshine and storm. His judgment of men was excellent. The unvarying and complete success he met in everything he undertook in that great war was due largely to his strong personality, unerring purpose, and dashing example. And Farragut is going to be used, his image is going to be used for a lot of purposes. In World War I, it shows up on a recruiting poster with Farragut up in the shrouds. The USS Hartford, Farragut's flagship, would undergo a variety of changes over the years. But in 1957, the Hartford was still around. She was moored at Norfolk Navy Yard while Congress was debating to appropriate money to restore, like they had the USS Constitution. And while they're doing that, the Hartford sinks to the pier. The Navy decides not to save her, and they break her up after 98 years of service. So the Hartford no longer exists. The name, though, exists in the modern submarine, USS Hartford, which was commissioned in 1994 and is still in active service. One of the great traditions of any Navy is to name naval ships after great heroes. And 5 ships have been named in honor of Admiral Farragut. The third one, USS Farragut, destroyer number 348, was commissioned in 1934. At Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, she was in what was called a nest with 3 or 4 other destroyers. And by 0852, the Farragut's able to break out of the nest, head down the channel while firing at Japanese warplanes trying to sink her. She's going to make it out of the harbor. She then received extensive service in World War II, earning 14 battle stars, including Guadalcanal, the Aleutians, Guam, the Philippines, and Iwo Jima. The ship was decommissioned on October 23, 1945, sold in 1947, and scrapped. The current USS Farragut, an R.A. Burke-class destroyer, was commissioned in 2006 and is still in service. The Philadelphia Evening Telegraph, in commenting on Farragut's death, reported, "He was a modest, warm-hearted, and whole-souled gentleman. He was one of those men who never appear to grow old, and although 60 years of age, when he assumed command of the fleet in the Gulf, his eye was as bright and his step as active as the youngest midshipman in his fleet. A strict disciplinarian, as he was in duty bound to be, Admiral Farragut never found it necessary to support his dignity by a haughty or imperious demeanor, and his genial and affable manners towards everyone, from the highest officer to the lowest sailor of his fleet, made their sentiments towards him partake of personal affection. And there was not an officer of the Navy who was more beloved by those under his command than this fine old hero. A man of men, Admiral Farragut would be mourned more sincerely than almost any other public man of the day. And by his death, the Navy loses its brightest ornament and the country a hero without fear and without reproach." I want to thank you folks for joining the staffing of the program. Does anybody have any questions at this point about anything I've talked about? Yes, sir.
Would Dewey outrank Farragut then? With that,
Would Dewey outrank Farragut?
yeah, with that, listing they gave him.
Maybe. Like I said, that's a unique rank established only for George Dewey. I've seen how Dewey ranks with five-star admirals and things like that. I've never seen him compared to Farragut. Of course, today we have all kinds of admirals in the Navy. What makes Farragut stand out is he was the first. The U.S. Congress had this prejudice against making admirals because they thought that smacked of European royalty, things like that. So the highest you could get before the Civil War was what was originally called Commodore. On the eve of the Civil War, they changed it as a flag officer. And that was simply a senior captain who commanded a squadron or a large naval installation, like Portsmouth or New York, someplace like that. And then once you got that, and that was sort of an honorary title, not a rank. So you didn't get paid for a Commodore or anything like that. But once you got that title, you were entitled to keep it. Okay? Yes, sir?
Did Farragut ever consider politics at all?
Do you ever consider politics? Not that I know of. He's a Navy guy.
Did the parties ever attempt to influence him to move in that direction?
Not that I'm aware of. Never seen that in his biographies. No.
So wildly popular.
What?
He was so wildly popular, you would think that.
You would think so, but that's not. He's apolitical. Now, like I said, he is conservative. He does back Andrew Johnson. When Johnson made the swing around the circle, Farragut was with him on that to try to pump up Johnson's plan for Reconstruction as opposed to the radical Republicans. But as I also said, by being on the European squadron, Farragut is out of that presidential debate. So when he comes back, the election's over, he can congratulate Grant. Nobody can criticize him for any statement he made because he didn't make any statements or anything like that. Grant probably didn't make any statements. I mean, this is a time when it was felt that the office should seek the man. And so if you were running for president, you at least try to give the appearance you weren't actually seeking the job. And so candidates like Grant would stay home. They wouldn't tour, they wouldn't give speeches, they wouldn't give policy statements, anything like that. They stayed quiet. People came to them to wish them well, and then their operatives gave speeches. So you had the appearance that you were not seeking the office was seeking you. I know it seems kind of strange today. The first person to break that mode is William Jennings Bryan. When he was nominated for president, he went campaigning. And of course, it's one of those things, once one person does it, everybody else got to start doing it. So now it's you seek the office, in a sense, not the other way around. Although we still have this idea that the office does kind of seek the person. It's still a nice theory. I don't know if it works anymore, but that's what we go with. Farragut himself had joined the Navy when he was 9.5 years old. So he served 60 of his 69 years in the Navy. Yeah. A midshipman at the age of 9.5, he got his first command when he was 12 years old. He was in command of a prize vessel. Him and 4 or 5 other American seamen. What had happened in the Navy pre-show, I had a picture up here of Commodore David Porter. And somebody asked if he's related to Admiral Porter. It's Admiral Porter's father. Commodore Porter is also Admiral Farragut's guardian. And you sometimes hear that Admiral Porter adopted Farragut. But of course, if you adopt somebody, they take your last name. They didn't have any adoption laws back then. So Porter agrees to take Farragut on as his ward. And in that capacity, it is Porter's legal and moral responsibility to make sure young Farragut is brought up properly. You know, he's trained to read and write, knows math, how to treat people, things like that, and to get him started in life. And so Porter got him in midshipman, commissioned at the age of 9.5, takes young Farragut with him on the USS Essex during the War of 1812. And the famous voyage of the Essex is Admiral Porter would go around Cape Horn into the South Pacific to attack British shipping. And of course, where's the last place the British expect to see an American warship? South Pacific. So Porter, in capturing all these ships out there, has his own little squadron. And of course, he's got to send some of these ships into port to report them as prize captures. And he put somebody on to make sure they get to port. So he was sending so many officers out, he had so many captures. At one point, the only officer he had to put on a prize ship was 12-year-old David Farragut. So he puts Farragut in charge of this ship with 4 or 5 seamen. The captain of the ship didn't like the idea of this 12-year-old giving him orders, of course. He goes down to his cabin and threatens to come up with a pair of pistols. Farragut tells the crew what to do, stands at the hatchway, basically tells the captain, if you come up here, I'll kill you. And the captain never came up. But can you imagine a 12-year-old today being put in charge of a prize vessel? No. So things have changed in the last 150-some, 200 years in that regard. We kind of forget, and this was not uncommon for 10, 12-year-old kids to get commissions as midshipmen in the Navy at this point. And also remember that it's not unusual for 15, 16-year-olds to be going to college back then. Either. It all depends on your skill and your abilities back then. And keep in mind, the Civil War, we've got a lot of 20-year-olds who are generals. So, and even in World War II, we're asking a lot of these 19, 20, 21-year-olds to take command of bombers flying over Germany. And that's, as someone said in a movie, that's a lot to ask to grow up when you're 21 years old. But times were a little different back then. Any other questions? I want to thank everybody for joining me today. I'll be around in case you do have any questions.